In the final centuries of the Roman Empire, the world was held together not only by laws and armies, but by an uneasy tension between faith and authority. Christianity had begun to spread across cities and provinces, yet it remained a religion often marked by suspicion, persecution, and sacrifice. It was in this fragile world that a young woman, later remembered in tradition as Saint Arsema, entered the path of consecrated life. In Armenian tradition, she is known as Saint Hripsime, a virgin whose life would become inseparable from the spiritual history of a nation. From early tradition, Arsema is described not merely as a figure of physical beauty, but as one whose presence reflected an unusual stillness, a depth of character shaped by prayer, discipline, and separation from worldly ambition. She belonged to a community of consecrated virgins, a spiritual order of women who chose to dedicate their entire existence to Christ. This community was guided by a spiritual mother, often identified as Saint Gayam, a woman of authority and spiritual maturity who shaped their life through prayer, fasting, and strict devotion. To understand Arsema's world, one must understand what it meant to choose such a life in that era. This was not a symbolic devotion or cultural tradition. It was a radical separation from everything that defined ordinary existence. Marriage, family expectations, social advancement, all were set aside. In their place stood prayer, silence, fasting, and a life oriented entirely toward God. In the Roman world, such devotion was not always understood. To reject marriage was to reject social structure. To live in consecrated purity was to reject political expectation. And most dangerously of all, to belong fully to Christ was to refuse the ultimate claim of imperial authority over the human body and soul. It is within this tension that Arsema's life begins to take shape, not as a political figure, not as a warrior, but as a spiritual contradiction. And it is precisely this contradiction that draws attention. Tradition tells us that word of her beauty and virtue eventually reached imperial ears, including the court of the Roman Emperor Diocletian. In his worldview, nothing should exist beyond imperial reach. Every life, every body, every allegiance ultimately belonged to the structure of empire. But Arsema did not belong to that structure. She belonged to Christ, and that difference would soon become the turning point of her life. What began as a quiet spiritual existence would soon be interrupted by the forces of power, desire, and political control. The empire would not ignore what it could not possess. And in that moment, Arsema's life would shift from hidden devotion into historical destiny. Because in the ancient world, silence was never protection for long. The attention of imperial power was not something that could be ignored or resisted without consequence. In the Roman world, when authority turned its gaze toward an individual, escape was rarely a matter of comfort. It became a matter of survival. For Arsema and her companions, the pressure intensified into a reality that left no room for negotiation. The life they had chosen hidden, disciplined, devoted entirely to Christ was now exposed to the machinery of empire. According to tradition, the Roman Emperor Diocletian sought to bring Arsema into his presence. In the logic of imperial authority, her refusal to conform was not interpreted as spiritual conviction, but as defiance of order itself. And in such a system, defiance demanded correction. They made a decision that would define their historical legacy. They would flee. This was not a flight motivated by fear alone. In early Christian understanding, exile was often interpreted as a form of spiritual pilgrimage. They left behind the structures of Roman society and moved into uncertainty. Their journey was long and marked by the constant risk of discovery. There were no guarantees of safety, only the conviction that remaining faithful to Christ was worth any cost imposed by the world. As they moved across regions and borders, they eventually arrived in a land that would become central to their story, Armenia. At that time, Armenia was ruled by King Tiridates III, a monarch shaped by both Roman influence and local sovereignty. Armenia itself stood at a crossroads of civilizations, positioned between empires, constantly negotiating its identity. To Arsema and her companions, Armenia initially appeared as a place of refuge. The land offered distance from Roman authority. They settled quietly, continuing their life of prayer and devotion. They did not seek influence, nor did they attempt to alter the society around them. Their existence remained centered on worship, discipline, and separation from worldly ambition. However, history rarely allows spiritual lives to remain hidden for long when they carry symbolic weight. The reputation of Arsema, her beauty, her discipline, and her dignity, once again began to spread. What had followed her from Rome now followed her into Armenia. King Tiridates III became aware of her presence, and in that moment, the dynamic of her life changed once again. Because exile does not always end persecution, it sometimes only relocates it. Tiridates did not interpret Arsema's consecration in spiritual terms. In his worldview, to refuse a king was to disrupt the order of existence itself. And so what had begun as refuge slowly transformed into confrontation. Arsema was summoned, not as a guest, but as someone expected to submit to royal authority. Arsema did not come before the king as one seeking negotiation. She came as one already committed and anchored in her choice. In the silence that followed, before any punishment, the story pauses. What happens when earthly authority meets a soul that refuses to yield? That question becomes the foundation for everything that follows. When Arsema stood before King Tiridates III, the encounter was not simply between two individuals. It was the meeting of two worldviews. On one side stood imperial authority structured, absolute, accustomed to obedience. On the other stood a consecrated life quiet, unwavering, and rooted in a conviction that no earthly throne could override divine allegiance. The king did not approach her with theological understanding. He approached her with expectation. In his mind, authority was self-evident. A king's command did not require justification. It required compliance. But Arsema did not respond to authority in the language of fear. She responded in the language of faith. Tradition preserves her refusal not as emotional defiance, but as calm conviction. She did not argue for herself, nor did she attempt to negotiate her position. Her identity was already settled beyond the reach of political power. She belonged to Christ. And that belonging was not symbolic, it was absolute. The king's patience quickly gave way to frustration. What he encountered was something far more difficult to control, a conscience that could not be purchased. In the ancient world, this was more destabilizing than open war, because armies could be defeated, but conviction could not be negotiated. When persuasion failed, pressure followed, and when pressure failed, authority often turned to force. Arsema and her companions, including those under the spiritual guidance of Saint Gaian, were now perceived as obstacles to order. What followed was their arrest. The transition from dialogue to imprisonment marks a critical shift in the narrative. Inside confinement, tradition emphasizes not despair, but endurance. They viewed suffering for faith as participatory in a larger divine reality. Prayer, therefore, did not cease in captivity. It intensified. Silence did not represent defeat. It represented continuity. Yet from the perspective of imperial authority, their persistence was intolerable. The refusal to yield had become an act that demanded resolution. And so, according to tradition, punishment was enacted with severity. The martyrdom is described as a sequence one life after another. Each death carried the same theological meaning, that the body could be destroyed, but the conviction it carried could not be erased. Arsema herself is remembered not through suffering alone, but through the silence she maintained in the face of it. In that silence, she becomes a theological symbol. The body is taken, but the testimony remains. In the logic of empire, execution is meant to end resistance. But in the logic of faith, martyrdom often begins something the empire cannot predict. What followed in Armenia was not the disappearance of Arsema's influence, but its transformation into something larger than her physical presence. Her death opened a narrative that would extend beyond her life and into the spiritual destiny of a kingdom. After the martyrdom of Arsema and her companions, the story does not move immediately into triumph or peace. Instead, it enters a period of disruption and unraveling that affects not only individuals, but the structure of authority itself. King Tiridates III, who had exercised absolute power over the fate of Arsema, begins to experience a profound internal collapse. Early Christian tradition describes this not merely as illness, but as a condition of mental and spiritual disintegration. He experiences an inability to function within the very authority he once controlled effortlessly. In historical memory, this moment is not presented as coincidence, but as consequence. The execution of Arsema is understood as an act that disrupted the moral and spiritual balance of the kingdom. The king who once commanded others now finds himself unable to command his own stability. Armenia, at the political level, enters a moment of uncertainty. But beneath that surface, something deeper is unfolding. It is at this point that another figure enters the narrative in a decisive way, Gregory the Illuminator. Gregory becomes the central spiritual instrument through which restoration is eventually made possible. He represents a form of authority that does not depend on force, but on spiritual legitimacy. According to tradition, Gregory is brought into proximity with the suffering king. Through prayer, endurance, and divine intervention, Tiridates is eventually restored, both physically and mentally. But restoration does not end with healing. It begins a transformation. The king who once resisted now begins to reflect. The power that once defined his identity is no longer sufficient. In this moment of vulnerability, the memory of Arsema and her companions takes on new meaning. Their deaths are no longer interpreted as isolated acts of punishment. They are reinterpreted as witnesses to truth. In the years that follow, Armenia undergoes one of the most significant transformations in early Christian history. Under Tiridates III, the kingdom becomes the first nation to formally adopt Christianity as its state religion. This shift was a consequence of spiritual change that had been unfolding beneath the surface of suffering and conviction. And within that transformation, the legacy of Arsema remains central. She does not appear as a ruler or conqueror, but as something far quieter and ultimately more enduring. A witness whose refusal could not be erased. A life that could not be rewritten by authority. A death that became memory, and a memory that became transformation. Spiritual conviction, when held without compromise, can outlast systems of power that appear far more permanent. Arsema's story continues in the identity of a nation that was changed through the very events surrounding her death. She becomes part of a foundational memory, one that links faith, suffering, and transformation into a single narrative arc. As the story closes, we are left not with spectacle, but with reflection, that power may shape the world for a time, but conviction can reshape it forever.